Living in the Pacific Northwest presents so many opportunities to explore nature. However, it is not without risk. This is my story. One Saturday, I ventured into the woods for an afternoon walk. On this particular day, I knew I had plenty of daylight ahead of me, so I ventured deeper into the woods than I normally would. Placing one foot in front of the other, I began to explore. Shadows clung to the trunks of the ancient trees, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. A shiver raced down my spine and I paused, feeling unseen eyes drilling into my back. I tried to shrug off the sensation, rationalizing that I was simply letting my imagination get the better of me. Yet, a deep-seated unease took root within me, suggesting this might not be the wisest course of action. However, I couldn't help but move forward. I was so desperate for adventure. The sudden crack of a breaking twig behind me jolted me out of my thoughts. Before I could spin around to face the noise, a strong hand closed around my shoulder. Fear clenched my heart like a vice. Slowly, very slowly, I turned to face the source of my terror. The sight before me was like something ripped out of a horror movie. A figure swathed in shadow and mystery loomed over me. His words, uttered in a voice that echoed like a growl in the eerie silence, made the hairs at the back of my neck stand up. "Why are you here?" he demanded. His question left me speechless. The figure closed the distance between us, his voice dropping to a whisper that was both chilling and ominous. "You've trespassed into a forbidden zone. This place isn't meant for your kind." And just like that, he was gone. His sudden disappearance left me standing in the middle of the woods, with my heart thumping against my ribcage. My mind was a whirlpool of confusion, but one thing was clear. Something malevolent was headed my way. I wasted no time. My instinct screamed at me to get out, and so I ran. My boots pounded against the ground as I dashed towards what I hoped was the way out, leaving the sinister shadows far behind. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the branches seemed like a monster ready to devour me. The chill in the air felt more pronounced, a constant reminder of the lurking danger. The sense of dread followed me, pressing on my mind, whispering of terrors hidden amongst the trees. It dawned on me that the forest had transformed from a place of mystery and exploration into a trap teeming with threats. Adrenaline fueled my hasty retreat through the undergrowth, my heart pounding in sync with my quick steps. I could feel the entity in the forest, biding its time, watching me. The chilling thought spurred me on, pushing my exhausted body to its limits. With fear still coursing through my veins, I continued to plow through the dense undergrowth, branches whipping against my face and arms. The distant rumble of thunder suggested an incoming storm, but it wasn't the weather that worried me. I could still sense the entity's presence, a growing sense of dread that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. Each stride I took felt like a small victory against the dark force that had held me captive. My legs were aching, the muscles screaming for respite, but I knew there was no time to rest. The feeling of being pursued was overwhelming, a relentless pressure that kept pushing me beyond my limits. The ground beneath me became rocky and treacherous as I ascended a steep incline. I dared not look back, fearing that the sight of whatever was behind me would paralyze me with fear. Despite my exhaustion, I kept climbing, each gasp of breath becoming more laborious as I neared the top. Breaking through a tangle of thorny vines, I found myself on a rocky ledge overlooking a steep drop. The sight of a fast-flowing river crashing against rocks far below sent a shiver of fear down my spine, but I knew it was my only option. I had to jump. With one last look at the shadowy forest, I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and leapt. The air whipped past me, and for a moment I was free, suspended in time and space. Then, the icy waters enveloped me, pulling me under with a force I hadn't anticipated. Struggling against the current, I swam towards the surface, the need for air burning in my lungs. I emerged from the water gasping but alive. The forest was now behind me, its menacing entity confined to the shadows. Treading water, I looked around for the nearest bank to haul myself out, but all I saw were rocky cliffs on either side. With a sinking feeling, I realized I was caught in a current that was swiftly carrying me downstream. The forest might be behind me, but my ordeal was far from over. The turbulent river had other challenges in store for me, and I would have to face them head-on, because there was no other choice. The water was unforgiving, pulling me downstream like a rag doll caught in a storm. The forest was a mere dark smudge in the distance now, replaced by towering cliffs on either side of the river. As I tumbled through the raging waters, the chilling sensation of being watched crept over me again, a feeling that I'd thought I'd left behind in the woods. With an abrupt gasp, my head broke the water's surface, the icy liquid filling my lungs replaced with a desperate gulp of air. My muscles screamed in protest as I struggled against the current, clawing my way to the surface and battling the invisible hands that were trying to drag me under. As I glanced around, I saw something that made my heart stutter. A figure on the riverbank, still as a statue, its form obscured in shadows. The same eerie figure from the woods. I blinked, trying to clear my waterlogged vision, but the figure remained, its menacing presence a stark contrast against the soft glow of the setting sun. Panic surged through me, stoking the flames of my already exhausted state. I was caught in a terrifying game of cat and mouse, with the river as my only means of escape. With renewed determination, I forced myself to kick, to paddle, to do anything that would propel me further downstream and away from the figure. The river had a different plan, though. The current, now stronger than ever, was pushing me towards a frothy whirlpool. A look over my shoulder confirmed my worst fears. The figure had started moving along the riverbank, its pace matching the speed of the current. It was hurting me, trapping me in a deadly predicament between the whirlpool and itself. I was running out of options. With the whirlpool on one side and the sinister figure on the other, I was caught in a deadly dance. And so, bracing myself for the worst, I pushed against the current, my body fueled by raw fear and determination. Inch by inch, I dragged myself towards the riverbank opposite where the figure stood, my body screaming in protest. Just as I thought I wouldn't make it, my hand hit something solid. A rock jutted out from the water near the riverbank. Summoning every bit of energy I had left, I hoisted myself onto the rock, hauling my body out of the punishing current. For a moment, I just lay there, panting and shivering, my eyes locked on the figure standing silently across the river. It didn't move, didn't make any attempt to cross the water. It just watched. Even from this distance, I could feel its icy gaze. And in that chilling gaze, I knew my ordeal was far from over. This was not a mere chase, it was a hunt, and I was the prey. The figure's presence was a cold reminder that I was still a long way from safety, and that the journey would be fraught with peril. With the figure's silhouette burned into my mind, I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. The river continued its aggressive swirl behind me, but the figure remained static, a stoic spectator to my struggle. Somehow, I found its silent presence more unnerving than any outward act of aggression. I was in its game now, and I had to figure out its rules if I wanted to survive. My eyes scanned the rocky terrain. I was on a narrow patch of land squeezed between the fierce river and the steep, craggy cliff. My heart pounded in my chest as I contemplated my next move. I could either attempt to climb the daunting cliffs in front of me, risking injury or worse, or I could try to navigate the dangerous waters, swimming further downstream in the hopes of finding a safer passage. The sun was now dipping behind the hills, casting an ominous glow on the landscape. My decision was made for me when I spotted a small outcrop on the cliff face that could provide a foothold. As terrifying as the thought of climbing was, it seemed safer than challenging the treacherous river again. I began to climb, my wet clothes sticking to my skin, making each movement an effort. My fingers searched for anything to hold onto, while my feet pushed against the rough, uneven surface. Every so often, I'd glance back at the figure across the river. It remained unmoved, silently watching me scale the cliffs. As I climbed higher, the air grew colder, biting through my soaked clothes. The wind howled, its icy fingers slipping into my bones. The distant figure seemed to blend into the gathering darkness, only its piercing gaze remaining constant. Eventually, I found a small ledge wide enough to rest on. My body ached from the exertion and the cold was starting to seep into my bones. I huddled against the cliff face, my eyes never leaving the spot where the figure had stood. The world around me seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the next act in this deadly game. The hours passed slowly. Night draped itself over the landscape, the moon and stars hidden behind a thick curtain of clouds. The darkness was oppressive, only interrupted by the occasional flash of movement from the corner of my eye. I was not alone. Not really. I knew my hunter was still out there, hidden in the darkness, watching, waiting. The river's rhythmic rumbling provided a haunting soundtrack to the otherwise silent night, but it did nothing to ease my frayed nerves. My muscles ached from the day's relentless pursuits, and a biting chill clung to me. The ledge was far from comfortable, but it was safe, for the moment at least. I clung to the rugged cliff face, my heart pounding in time with the far-off echo of nocturnal creatures stirring to life. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, but the shadowy figure was nowhere in sight. It was biding its time, an ever-present specter lurking just out of sight. My mind raced, replaying every interaction with the mysterious figure, searching for some hint about what it wanted or why it was pursuing me. Was it something I had inadvertently done? A territory I had unknowingly trespassed? The questions swirled in my head, each more troubling than the last. As the night wore on, fatigue began to pull at my eyelids. I fought against it, knowing that sleep would make me vulnerable. But my body had its limits, and the exhaustion was starting to creep in, clouding my thoughts and slowing my reactions. In the dead of night, a rustling sound echoed from the direction of the river. I snapped to alertness, my breath hitching as I strained to see through the darkness. A figure slowly emerged from the shadows, moving with an unsettling grace. It was him. As he moved closer to the river's edge, I held my breath, watching his every move. He didn't look towards me, his focus seemingly on the water as he stood still, a strange light illuminating the turbulent waters. The standoff continued, the tension thick in the cold night air. It was clear that I wouldn't be given the respite of sleep. This figure, whoever or whatever it was, had become an inescapable part of my journey. The night was still young and the game was far from over. The night felt long, endless even. My body screamed for rest, my muscles protesting against the cold, hard stone of the cliff face. Every time I tried to close my eyes, the eerie glow from the figure would seep through my eyelids, a cruel reminder of the haunting presence nearby. Each rustle, each whispered echo carried by the wind, kept me on edge, my heart beat a staccato rhythm in the eerie stillness. Hours seemed to drag into days as I clung to the ledge, my eyes never leaving the figure bathed in an uncanny luminescence. He was motionless, a statue looming at the edge of the river, the light around him casting grotesque shadows on the water's surface. The river rumbled on, oblivious to the strange tableau. When the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the figure seemed to shimmer, the light around him pulsing in time with the increasing brightness. And then, in a sudden gust of wind, the figure vanished. The strange light flickered out, leaving an empty space where he'd stood just moments ago. A mixture of relief and apprehension filled me. His disappearance didn't mean the danger was gone. If anything, it made me more nervous, the uncertainty of his whereabouts adding a new layer to my fear. Carefully, I began my ascent, my fingers seeking purchase on the rough stones. The morning air was cold, my breath fogging up in front of me. Above, the cliff stretched seemingly forever, an imposing wall standing between me and the world above. As I scaled the cliff, my mind was filled with thoughts of the figure, his eerie glow, and his sudden disappearance. They were enigmas I had to unravel, pieces of a puzzle I was yet to understand. The climb was grueling. Every inch gained felt like a small victory, a testament to my will to survive. As I ascended, the world below became smaller, the raging river a mere thread in the grand tapestry of nature. With the rising sun came the warmth, a stark contrast to the biting chill of the night. It seeped into my bones, reigniting a spark of hope within me. I clung to the cliff face, pulling myself up, inch by painful inch. My breath came in ragged gasps, my muscles straining with the effort. Each heave, each pull was a declaration of my intent. I would not be beaten. Not by the figure, not by the river, not by the cliff. Midway up, I paused for a moment, allowing myself a brief respite. My gaze was drawn to the river below, its surface gleaming in the morning light. My heart hammered in my chest as I scanned the riverbank, half expecting to see the figure materialize out of thin air. But the bank was empty. Resuming my climb, I kept a steady pace, conserving my energy as much as I could. As the hours passed, the cliff face seemed to stretch even higher, the promise of the summit a distant dream. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind's soft whispers and the distant rush of the river. A sudden shift beneath my fingers sent a jolt of panic through me. The rock I was holding onto gave way, tumbling down the cliff. I scrambled for a grip, my heart leaping into my throat. Just when I thought I would fall, my hand found another crevice and I hauled myself up onto a wider ledge. Resting there, I realized the climb was taking its toll. My arms were heavy, my legs shaky. My eyes strayed towards the river again. I saw no sign of the figure, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, the sensation of eyes boring into my back. Casting one last look at the river below, I steeled myself and resumed my climb. The uncertainty of what awaited me at the top was less daunting than what I was leaving behind. The figure remained a specter in my mind, a dark phantom that could reappear at any moment. Despite the exhaustion gnawing at me, I had to press on. The sun was high in the sky when I finally reached the summit. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the sudden expanse of open space after hours of seeing nothing but rock and the distant river. As I took in the panorama spread out before me, I felt a sense of awe. The world looked so different from up here, tranquil, untouched, almost ethereal. Despite the breathtaking view, I couldn't afford to lose focus. I surveyed the landscape carefully, my eyes scanning for any sign of movement or threat. There were trees dotting the landscape, their lush canopies a stark contrast to the barren cliff I'd just ascended. Fatigue threatened to pull me under, but I forced myself to stay alert. I needed to find shelter, a place to rest safely. I couldn't afford to let my guard down, not when the figure could reappear at any moment. I started to make my way along the edge of the cliff, my legs protesting with each step. The ground was uneven, strewn with pebbles and rocks that slipped and rolled under my feet. Yet it felt infinitely safer than the precipitous climb. Suddenly, an echoing cry rang out through the quiet, the sound causing my blood to run cold. It was a sound unlike anything I'd heard before, somewhere between a howl and a scream. There was an eerie familiarity to it that made my skin prickle. It was the figure. I whipped around, my eyes searching the landscape behind me. For a moment, everything was still. Then, emerging from the shadows of the trees, the figure appeared. His spectral light, less pronounced in the daylight, but the air around him shimmered, as if the world itself recoiled from his presence. His gaze locked onto mine. A shiver ran down my spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The figure started moving towards me, his movements slow and deliberate. I took a step back, my heart pounding. The figure didn't speed up, didn't make any sudden moves. It was as if he was savoring the chase, the game of cat and mouse. The world around us seemed to hold its breath, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. I had come a long way from the depths of the forest, endured the treacherous river, and scaled the towering cliff. I was tired and worn out, but I wouldn't give up. Seeing the figure approach, I had a quick decision to make. Did I stand my ground or did I run? Looking into his eerie luminescence, I felt a shiver of fear, but alongside it, a spark of determination ignited. I'd run enough. Now it was time to confront whatever this was head-on. I squared my shoulders and held my ground. He continued his approach, his gait steady and unchanging. Every instinct in me screamed to flee, but I remained rooted to the spot, my resolve unwavering. As he drew closer, I noticed he was taller than I remembered, his frame imposing. The light around him pulsed rhythmically, a beacon in the broad daylight. His eyes were locked on mine, a predatory focus that left me feeling like a deer caught in the headlights. He stopped a few yards away from me, his gaze never leaving mine. The air between us crackled with tension, a standoff in the otherwise peaceful landscape. "Why are you chasing me?" I found my voice, my words cutting through the stillness. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly, the light around him pulsating a little faster. "You trespassed into a place where humans don't belong," he finally replied, his voice as low and unnerving as it had been in the forest. "I didn't know," I protested. "I was just exploring." He didn't seem convinced. There was a moment of silence, the figure contemplating my words. "Leave," he said eventually. "Go back where you came from." "And if I can't?" I challenged, a spark of defiance flaring within me. He paused, his gaze seeming to bore into me. "Then you must face the consequences." His cryptic warning hung in the air, a dark cloud looming over me. But I wouldn't back down now. I was tired of running, tired of the fear. No more. "Whatever it takes," I said firmly, holding his gaze. He seemed taken aback, as if he didn't expect me to stand my ground. "Good." He remained silent for a moment, then slowly he backed away, disappearing into the tree line, the glow around him slowly fading until it was gone. The silence of the landscape swallowed up his departure, returning the world to its previous tranquility. But the tranquility was deceptive. I knew I wasn't safe, not yet. I had no idea what the consequences the figure mentioned were, but I knew I had to be ready. After the figure vanished, I stood there for a while, lost in my thoughts. The silence around me was almost deafening after our exchange. There was a lot to process, a lot to understand. But most importantly, a plan needed to be made. I moved away from the cliff edge, my eyes scanning the landscape before me. It was time to find some sort of shelter, some respite from the exhausting ordeal I had been through. To one side of me, the cliff stretched away into the distance. On the other side lay a seemingly endless expanse of open land, marked here and there by clusters of trees and shrubs. A part of me longed to rest right there, to collapse on the ground and let sleep claim me. But I knew that it wasn't safe, not when the figure could return at any time. I had to keep moving, to put as much distance between him and me as possible. I set off towards the nearest cluster of trees, my legs heavy with fatigue. My mind was a whirl of thoughts, questions about who the figure was, why he had been chasing me, and what he meant by consequences. The walk was long, the midday sun beating down on me. By the time I reached the trees, I was drenched in sweat and my legs were shaking with exhaustion. But it was worth it. The trees offered shade and a sense of security. I found a spot where the trees were dense, the canopy above forming a sort of natural shield. I sank down onto the cool earth, leaning against the trunk of a large tree. It was far from the comfort of a bed, but it was the best I could get right now. As I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but think of the figure. Would he return? Would he come after me again? With that thought, I finally allowed exhaustion to take over, my eyes fluttering closed. The sounds of the wilderness became a distant hum as sleep claimed me, a momentary respite from the chaos and fear. However, even in sleep, my mind couldn't let go of the figure. The words "face the consequences" echoing hauntingly. The uncertainty was a heavy burden, an ominous cloud hanging over the horizon. But I was ready to face whatever came next. Ready to unravel the mysteries, ready to survive, ready to fight. For now, I would rest, but when I awoke, the game would be back on. As sleep loosened its grip, I became vaguely aware of my surroundings again. The ground beneath me, the canopy above, and the chirping of birds in the distance. I opened my eyes to the gentle light of early dawn filtering through the trees. I hadn't planned on sleeping through the entire day and night, but it seemed my body had other plans. Sitting up, I took a moment to gather my thoughts. The figure, the chase, the warning, it all seemed like a surreal dream now. But the rawness of my hands and the aching in my limbs served as a stark reminder of the reality. I scanned the surrounding woods but found no sign of the figure. A sense of relief washed over me. However, I knew that the reprieve was likely temporary. There was no telling when he might reappear. With renewed determination, I decided it was time to move again. I couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. My life had turned into a twisted game of hide and seek, and I had to stay one step ahead. I ventured deeper into the forest, my senses on high alert. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. But hours passed, and there was no sign of the figure. Despite the lingering fear, I couldn't help but appreciate the beauty of the wilderness around me. It was a slice of untouched nature, away from the humdrum of city life, beautiful yet brutal, serene yet unforgiving. As the day wore on, I found a small stream. The sight of the glistening water was like finding an oasis in a desert. I hurried towards it, bending down to take a refreshing sip. It was cold, crisp, reinvigorating. I filled my makeshift container, a large hollow leaf, planning to carry as much as I could. As I moved away from the stream, I felt a strange sensation. It was as if I was being watched. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes scanning the surrounding area. There was no one, just the silent trees, swaying gently in the wind. But I wasn't going to be hunted down so easily. The figure might be lurking around, biding his time, but I wouldn't be caught off guard. I was ready to confront whatever came my way. Whether it was finding my way back home or figuring out how to coexist in this strange land, I was prepared. As dusk fell, I found myself navigating the forest using only my instincts and the fading light. The forest was an entirely different beast when the sun went down. Shadows danced on the tree trunks, the silence only punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. Even the air felt heavier, charged with the latent threat that had been my companion since I stumbled into these woods. I found a spot to camp for the night, a small clearing surrounded by dense foliage that provided some semblance of safety. As I settled down, my back against the bark of a tree, I couldn't help but feel a pang of loneliness. I was miles away from civilization, from anyone who knew me or could help me. It was just me, the forest, and the unspoken promise of the figure's return. Even though I was shrouded in darkness, I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. The rustling leaves might be the figure creeping up on me. The shadows might hide his form, the silence broken at any moment by his haunting voice. I gripped a sharp stone in my hand, the only defense I had, and stared into the impenetrable darkness beyond the clearing. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. I listened to the rhythmic symphony of the wilderness, the insects, the occasional bird call, the whispering wind. They were familiar sounds, yet in the solitude they took on an almost alien quality. In the depth of the night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was as if the figure was just beyond my sight, hidden in the darkness, waiting. I held my breath, my eyes darting around, trying to penetrate the gloom. Then, just when I was starting to question my sanity, a familiar glow appeared at the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure stepped into the moonlight. His eyes met mine, the same predatory focus from before. He was back. I tightened my grip on the sharp stone, my entire body tensed and ready. But he didn't attack, didn't move. He just stood there, at the edge of the clearing, watching. A tense silence fell over the clearing. Neither of us moved, two opponents locked in a standoff. His gaze was unwavering, challenging me to make the first move. But I held my ground, determined not to show fear. I didn't know how long we sat there in silence, our staring contest unbroken. The moon traced its path across the sky, the forest whispered its lullabies, and we remained, two figures locked in a peculiar dance of defiance. With the break of dawn, he finally broke eye contact and, without a word, disappeared back into the forest, leaving me alone once more in the dawning light. His departure did nothing to alleviate the sense of unease. If anything, just as the times before, it amplified it. The figure was close, watching, waiting and biding his time. It wasn't a question of if he would return, but when. The cold dawn greeted me with a slight shiver. My muscles ached from the tense standoff and my mind was a flurry of questions. But despite the chill, there was a renewed fire within me. The figure's return and his silent threat had stoked my resolve. I was still a long way from safety, but I felt a strange sense of determination growing within me. Gathering my sparse belongings, I moved deeper into the forest, the growing light a reassuring companion in the eerie quiet. A small part of me hoped that with each step, I was getting closer to an escape. But the larger, more cynical part knew the figure wouldn't make it easy. He had shown he was patient and cunning, and it was clear he was playing a long game. Despite the sense of dread, I couldn't let fear rule me. I had to keep moving, keep surviving, no matter how hopeless it seemed. I had no weapons, no guide, no understanding of where I was or how to get back. But I was alive, and as long as I was breathing, I had a chance. The forest was starting to feel like an unending labyrinth, each turn leading me deeper into its belly. But every now and then, I would stumble upon something that hinted at a world beyond this leafy prison. A trickle of water from a nearby stream, a footprint on the muddy ground, the distant sound of what might have been a vehicle. Each sign was a lifeline, a small shred of hope that helped me push through. Eventually, night started to fall again, the setting sun casting long, creeping shadows. I found a suitable place to camp, my back against a sturdy tree, eyes straining to see through the thick veil of the night. The figure could be anywhere, his silent form concealed by the dark. The hours bled into each other as I waited for his return. The nocturnal creatures once again took over the orchestra of the forest, their sounds echoing through the silence. I felt like an intruder in their world, my presence an unwelcome disturbance. When the figure finally stepped into the moonlight, it was with the same quiet intensity as the night before. He didn't attack or approach. He just stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me with those piercing eyes. It was a silent assertion of his control, a grim reminder of my situation. He vanished once more with the first rays of dawn, disappearing into the forest as if he had never been there. And once again, I was left alone to face the day, my heart pounding with the weight of our unspoken standoff. The forest, the figure, the fear, they were all part of my reality now. Each day was a challenge, each night a silent battle. Days turned into weeks. The forest became my unwilling home, the figure my unwelcome companion. Our silent standoffs became an integral part of my existence, shaping my days and haunting my nights. I was learning, adapting, and most importantly, I was fighting. Then, one evening, as the sunset painted the sky in hues of red and orange, the figure stepped out of the shadows again. But this time, something was different. His gaze was harder, his presence heavier. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense of finality that sent a chill down my spine. I knew instinctively that this was it, the final showdown. As he stepped into the clearing, I stood my ground, holding on to the makeshift spear I had crafted from a broken branch. The fire in his eyes matched the one in mine. It was no longer a game of cat and mouse, it was a fight for survival. For what seemed like hours, we stood there, two figures locked in a standoff under the moonlit sky. The forest held its breath, as if anticipating the battle to come. Then, in a flash, the figure lunged at me. I sidestepped his attack, jabbing my spear towards him. He evaded it with a swift move, his dark form a blur in the moonlight. Our dance of danger had begun. We battled, our moves mirroring each other's in a twisted ballet. His strength was unmatched, his agility superior. But my determination, my will to survive, were weapons he couldn't combat. I fought, ignoring the searing pain in my muscles and the pounding in my head. I was pushed to my limits, then pushed even more. However, sheer desperation kept me going. Finally, after a grueling exchange, I saw an opening. Gathering all my strength, I lunged forward, my spear aimed at him. There was a moment of silence, and then a sharp gasp as the spear found its mark. The figure stumbled backward, a look of surprise flashing in his eyes before he collapsed onto the ground. For a moment I stood there, panting, staring at the fallen figure. But there was no time to celebrate. I knew I had to move. I had to get out. I turned and sprinted, using the last reserves of my energy. The forest seemed to part for me, the shadows less menacing, the path ahead clearer. I ran with a single goal in mind: escape. As the first light of dawn broke, I saw it, the edge of the forest. Tears welled up in my eyes as I broke through the tree line, emerging from the forest's grasp. I had done it. I had survived. I couldn't wait to get home and rest. And in a surprising twist, I also couldn't wait for the opportunity to take another walk into the deep woods.